1962, a proposal was written, not by outsiders, not by conspiracy theorists, but by the highest levels of the United States military. It outlined a plan, detailed, structured, approved at multiple levels. A plan to create attacks, not from an enemy, but from within. The goal wasn't destruction. It was justification. Because at the time, tensions were rising. The Cold War was escalating, and there was growing pressure to take direct action against Cuba. But there was a problem. There wasn't enough public support, and without support, there couldn't be war. So a solution was proposed, one that didn't rely on waiting. It relied on creating. The document described scenarios: aircraft being hijacked, civilian targets attacked, military assets sabotaged, even the possibility of staging casualties. All of it designed to appear as though it came from Cuban forces. Every detail carefully constructed, every outcome controlled, so that the narrative would be clear. An attack had occurred, and retaliation would be justified. It wasn't vague. It wasn't theoretical. It was operational. A blueprint for events that would shape public perception. Because in war, perception is everything. The proposal became known as Operation Northwoods. And what makes it different is not just what it suggested. It's that it was medial. Declassified years later. Confirmed. Not speculation, not rumor. An official plan created within the system, considered seriously, and then not carried out. At least, not in the form described. The proposal was ultimately rejected, but the fact that it existed changes something, because it demonstrates a capability, a willingness to consider actions that operate beyond what the public assumes is possible. False flag operations, narrative control, strategic manipulation of events, not as theory, but as documented strategy. And once something like that is confirmed, it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of what the system is capable of, which raises a question that extends beyond that moment. If a plan like that could be created, how many others were? How many were proposed, but never revealed? And how many moved forward without ever being connected back to their origin? Because Operation Northwoods wasn't exposed immediately, it remained hidden for years, until it was no longer relevant, until it could be acknowledged without consequence. And by then, the moment had passed, the impact neutralized by time. But the implication remains. Because the plan didn't rely on technology. It relied on control. Control of information. Control of narrative. Control of what people believe happened versus what actually happened. And in today's world, that control is even more powerful, faster, more precise. Because information doesn't just spread. It's shaped, directed, amplified, or suppressed, which means the methods outlined in that document don't belong to the past. They've evolved. They've adapted. And they may be operating in ways that are far more difficult to detect. Because the most effective version of a controlled narrative is one that doesn't look controlled at all. It looks real. It feels real. It spreads naturally, even if it wasn't. So when you hear about events that seem perfectly aligned, perfectly timed, perfectly positioned to justify what follows, consider this: not whether it was staged, but whether it could have been, because the capability has already been proven. Not in theory, not in speculation, but in writing. Approved, structured, and nearly executed. Operation Northwoods wasn't just a plan. It was a glimpse into how far a system might be willing to go to create the conditions it needs. And once you've seen that, it becomes harder to assume that every event happened exactly the way it was presented. Because sometimes the story isn't just reported, it's designed. There's also the role of perception in planning, because operations like this aren't just about action. They're about reaction. How people would respond, what they would believe, what would feel real enough to trigger a response. Because the objective isn't just the event, it's the interpretation of the event. And that requires understanding behavior, public response, emotional reaction, which means planning extends beyond logistics into psychology. Then there's plausibility, because for something to be believed, it has to fit expectation. It has to align with what people already think is possible, which means the scenario itself is designed carefully, structured in a way that feels authentic, even if it isn't. And that authenticity is what creates acceptance. There's also containment, because operations involving perception require control over information. What is released? What is withheld? What is emphasized? Because once a narrative is introduced, it has to be maintained, protected from contradiction, reinforced over time, which creates a closed loop, where the version presented becomes the version accepted, not because it's confirmed, but because it's consistent. And consistency is what builds belief.